I'm Dr. Andy King. I am a lecturer in medieval history at the University of Southampton. I've done various bits of work on various castles, particularly on the Anglo-Scottish marches, but I got interested in the castles of Edward I when I was a kid, when I got taken to them by my parents. And in today's talk, I am going to be discussing various different aspects of those castles. Something about the design, something about the construction, the purpose of them, and the vast quantities of money that were spent on them. Today I'm going to be talking about Edward I's castles in Wales. I'll be discussing introducing various aspects of them. I'm afraid it's going to be a bit of a jog trot. There's quite a lot to get through, but hopefully it will give you some idea of some of the more interesting aspects of these castles. And a couple of themes I particularly want to highlight. The sheer variety of these castles, the sheer variety of the design of them. I'll be talking a little bit about the possible influences on their design, and I'll be commenting briefly on their architects, if we can indeed use that term. The other thing that's worth bearing in mind is their enormous cost. That will be one of the things I'll be discussing in some detail. But it's worth bearing in mind that this was a huge project in terms of both manpower and money, and in fact resources generally. As we'll see, the cost was such that a lot of these castles were never even finished. The other thing to bear in mind, I'm not going to be talking much about their function or use. Jeremy, I think, will be discussing that in much rather more detail later. But as we've just heard, it's worth bearing in mind all of these places had residential and lordship functions and were meant as places to live in, so bear that in mind as well. Now, one of the things I was very fortunate in the study of Edward I's castles was that England in the late 13th century was, by the standards of the time, a very bureaucratic government. And records were kept sometimes in triplicate. You can go to the National Archives in Kew and still look at these records. There's acres of dead sheepskin covered in writing, and they provide a lot of evidence. This is the account of Master Richard of Abingdon, the King's Chamberlain at Carnarvon, Conwy, Criccieth and Harloch, and this is the accounts just for the year 1285-6, and you can see it gives you some idea of some of the detail we have recording the expenses in building these castles. So they are, by the standards of the time, comparatively very well documented. What we don't have, however, is details of the thinking that went into the design. And the planning, the architecture, we don't have, for instance, any contracts specifying the details. For some private castles, there are contracts surviving which specify how the castle is to be built. We don't get any of these about Edward I's castles, probably because he was employing masons personally, his own staff, and he could discuss the details with them as required. So it wasn't necessary to specify them in a formal contract. It's also worth noting, of course, that we have these records, and it's worth noting, of course, that they weren't made for the benefit of historians in the 21st century. very useful though they are, but they're actually designed to cover the backs of the clerks who are responsible for them. It's to make sure that nobody's ripping off money and to make sure that money's being spent as it is, as it should be, or at least to give the appearance that money is being spent as it should be should be done. So obviously there's a certain amount of tidying up in these accounts, and they only record information which was thought to be useful at the time. So there are limitations to these sources. Now, we'll be looking at the castles in roughly, the construction of these castles in roughly 3 phases dictated by wars and risings in Wales. First phase starts with the Welsh War of 1276 to 7, when Edward I went to war with Gwynedd ap Gruffydd, who had been recognised by the English as Prince of Wales, defeated him and reduced greatly the extent of Gwyned's power. At this stage, of course, Gwynedd ap Gruffydd was still left as ruler of Gwynedd, but at a greatly reduced extent of power. And the castles we'll be looking at, here's Gwynedd, and the castles initially built are Wilf, Aberystwyth, Rutherland and Flint. And you'll see that these are built to constrain Gwynedd. It's worth bearing in mind, without the benefit of hindsight, when these castles were built, Edward didn't know that he would defeat Gwynedd and Gwynedd ap Gruffydd would be killed within a few years. So at this stage, it's very much aimed at constraining Gwynedd and preventing Gwynedd ap Gruffydd from recovering his position. You'll also note that Flint, Rutherland and Aberystwyth are built on the coast, very deliberately to allow them to be resupplied by sea, so that in the event of sieges it would be possible to keep them supplied, and of course the very practical reason that it's a lot easier to supply a castle by sea than by land, particularly in mountainous countryside like Wales. It's also worth bearing in mind that these castles were built very much as part of the campaign against Gwynedd ap Gruffydd in 1277, 1276. And Edward's army was actually accompanied by labourers recruited from across England, and the construction of the castles was begun while the war was still being fought. So it's very much part and parcel of the campaign to reduce Gwynedd ap Gruffydd's power. Now, I'll give you a quick overview of the various castles which were built as I go through the talk. First one is Wilf, I think that's how you pronounce it, and this is the least well known of Edward's castles, the least explored. As you can see, there's only earthworks left of it. It's actually a rebuilding of an existing motte and bailey castle. You can see the motte there and the bailey, which was destroyed by Gwynedd ap Gruffydd in 1260. We know that there were 5 years of building works at the site at a total recorded cost of nearly £1,700. You can see the figure down there. You'll notice the accounts give very exact details. That's actually £1,666, 9 shillings, 5 1/4 pence. I say that this was to make sure that literally every single quarter penny was accounted for. We know there was a great tower built there, but what form that took, what form the castle took, we don't know, because the entire castle is now, well, the entire stonework of the castle has now vanished and it's never been excavated. So that's all that can really be said about that. But it's probably the least innovative of Edward's castles, simply on the grounds that the design of it was based on an existing structure. Most of the rest of the castles, when we're talking about, were built entirely de novo, from new. That's also true of Aberystwyth, the first of the concentric castles which are so well known. That's over an aerial view of what's now standing at Aberystwyth. That's a ground plan. You'll see, as originally constructed, it's partially concentric, with a inner bailey with an outer wall against, and the sea was only protected initially by one wall. You'll also notice the double-towered gatehouse, which is so characteristic of Edward's castles in North Wales, with an additional gatehouse in front of it, and with the corner towers and a rhomboid shape. Moving on to Flint. Flint is a very different design. Again, it's worth emphasising the sheer variety of the designs in these castles. There wasn't one sort of master plan. Flint was not concentric, was never intended to be concentric. It's actually got a very unusual plan for an English castle. You'll notice the bailey here, roughly square, but the tower, the Great Tower, is actually entirely separate, walled off from the inner bailey. That is very unusual for English castles. The design of the tower itself is very interesting, with 2 floors, or possibly more, with a ground floor with various chambers, then an upper floor. It's not entirely clear whether the central space there was roofed over or not. This may have been a single chamber akin to, say, York. But the design is very unusual. It may well have been inspired by, this is the Tour de Constance in Ardmore in southern France. And it's worth noting that Edward I was personally familiar with with Ardmore, having travelled there when he was on crusade in 1270 with the King of France. So it's possible that Flint may have been based partly on Edward I's personal idea or suggestion. And again, it's something I'll be coming back to with the design of these castles. Who was responsible for designing them is a question which there has been a great deal of scholarly ink spilled over the decades. It's worth bearing in mind, of course, that the wishes of a patron as powerful as Edward I would have had a certain amount of weight. Right, moving on to Rutherland Castle, built over overall it was built over about 3 decades, but most of it was finished in 1277 to 80. And this is a pattern we find with a lot of these castles. There'll be an initial, very concentrated building campaign which would finish the castle to a stage where it was pretty much defensible. Then there would be years of desultory building work where the rest of the interior buildings were gradually assembled. In this case, there's a total recorded expenditure of over £9,000. But again, it's worth bearing in mind there's a lot of these castles, certainly during Edward the First's reigns, would have been more or less permanent building sites. This is a plan. Again, in this case, fully concentric castle. Again, a rhomboid shape with 2 towers, 2 gatehouses. But you'll notice if we go back to Aberystwyth, although both are concentric castles with double gatehouses, they're both very different concepts in plan. Right, so that's the first phase. 1282 to 3, Llewellyn ap Gruffydd is killed in a major campaign, major war, led by Edward I. And we get a new phase of castle building. First of all, it's worth thinking briefly about the defensibility of these castles. Aberystwyth, as we'll see, was captured by the Welsh during the war in 1282 to 3. And when you look at this report, you'll understand how they managed to do it. This is a fort from one Burgo de Neuville, appointed Justiciar of West Wales and the keeper of Aberystwyth, Cardigan, Carmarthen, Dynevor and Carrickenen castles in January 1280. And when he arrived at Aberystwyth, he was appalled. He wrote to Edward I saying, "I know, sire, that I have seen the castle all empty, without supplies, or provision, or crossbows, or armour. And when I came there was neither lock nor bar for any of the gates, and all of them were left open, both day and night." And he goes on to say that it'll only be through the aid of God that he manages to keep the castle. And as it turned out, God says it turned out to be slightly lacking. So Aberystwyth is captured in 1282 on the Feast of Mary, the equinox, that's 25th of March. Gruffydd ap Meredith and Rhys ap Maelgwyn gained possession of the town of Aberystwyth and the castle, and they burned the town and the castle and destroyed the rampart that was around the castle and the town, sparing the garrison their lives because of the days of Passion, i.e. Easter, were at hand. In probability, the garrison came to terms with the attackers and agreed to surrender the castle, probably because it wasn't defendable, not having any gates. Aberystwyth had to be rebuilt. To what extent it was damaged is difficult to say, but certainly there were building works, and it now becomes a fully concentric castle with a wall and towers built across that where that had originally not been concentric. So we now have it turned into a fully concentric castle. The cost of doing that was nigh on £4,000, so there probably was a certain amount of rebuilding as well. Other castles were now new castles were built. Harlech, Carnarvon and Conwy. This is Conwy. You get a good sense here, this is something I'll come back to later, you get a good sense here of just how big these castles were. Conwy literally dominates the town it was built with, and that was very deliberate. It was actually at the time, it would have been whitewashed, so it would have looked rather less grim, but it would still have looked very magnificent. You also get a sense here, the town walls, which were built integral with the castle. And Conwy was meant as a unit with a castle and a borough of which was inhabited very deliberately with English women as a island of Englishness in Wales. Here's the plan. It's built on a promontory on a site which had been a centre of Welsh lordship, which again was a very deliberate piece of siting as a way of indicating the new order, the new English order within what had been a Welsh polity. Due to the constraints of the site, it's not a concentric castle. Built on a promontory. For the same reason, it didn't have a gatehouse. What it does have, however, are these machicolations. And interestingly, this is the first recorded case of the use of machicolations in Britain. This is a more this example of machicolation which survived rather better, actually from Craigmillar Castle in Scotland from the 15th century, but you can get the idea. They hang over the walls and you can drop offensive material through the holes. Basically, they are a stone version of the wooden hoards which would previously have been built over walls in castles. This is Harlech, built in 1283 to 1301. These are recorded building works at least. But again, mainly built in 1286 to 9. At a total cost of 8,600 odd pounds. With Harlech Castle, it's possible to work out the building sequence, and we can see that as originally constructed, you have this is the sea, the cliff above the sea. So all the defences are built initially along the most vulnerable stretches, with the towers being left for later to make a basically defensible castle. Once that's been done, they fill in the rest, add the towers and the residential accommodation. So in these cases you can see there was an initial desire to build a defensible structure which could then be subsequently turned into a castle. Again, you have the classical gatehouse with concentric defences, but in this case the outer defences are not as well developed as, let's say, at Rutherglen or Aberystwyth, that we've seen before. There's no, for instance, no proper gatehouse or a very impressive gatehouse at the front. Now, come on to Carnarvon. which is perhaps and very deliberately the most impressive of Edward's castles. Again, built at a site of political and indeed historical significance, as we'll see, and again built integrated with defences of a borough. Also note the banding on the walls and the polyagonal towers, which we'll come back to later. Again, the building sequence was designed to make a defensible structure which could then be turned into a proper castle. It was built in combination with the town walls as part of the circuit. So you get the outer part of the castle, which is then later turned into a proper castle. At this point, the building sequence was interrupted by rebellion, which I'll come back to shortly. We also, it's also worth noting that as part of the campaign of fortifying, as it were, North Wales, we get the reuse of some of Llywelyn ap Gruffydd's castles. Again, this is very symbolic sign of the installation of a new authority. This is Edward taking over Edward's appropriating Llywelyn ap Gruffydd's own symbols of authority. The three North Wales which were rebuilt are Dolwyddelyn, Castell-y-Beirdd and Criccieth. Just to give you a run through, I won't go through all of them, but to show you what was done at Criccieth. This is Criccieth. You'll notice it already had a very impressive English-style gatehouse, which had been built by Llywelyn ap Gruffydd. Now, it's contested exactly what Edward did to it. We know he spent £564, 9 shillings, 6 3/4 pennies, but exactly what he got for that is debatable. But the usual idea is that he modified some of the buildings, added a tower, well, that tower there. So this was basically a modification rather than a major rebuilding, perhaps stamping Edward's authority on the castles of Llywelyn who had been removed. And for all these castles, they are fairly minor rebuilding. We get another war in 1294-5 with the rising of Madoc ap Llywelyn. He had actually supported, as had many of the Welsh, he'd supported Edward against Llywelyn ap Gruffydd previously, but was somewhat disaffected by the rather inadequate reward, the inadequate thanks he got for doing so. So it was a major rebellion. It's worth noting that Edward actually spent Christmas at Conwy besieged by Welsh rebels. As well, a nice tale in Walter of Gisborough that he actually insisted on sharing the last of his wine with his men. Has to be said that Walter of Gisborough is given to improving on a good tale, so make of that what you will. During the rebellion, Carnarvon was sacked. There was extensive damage to the site. It had to be repaired, and it was only after this stage that it was actually fully turned into a castle with the inner walls here. Again, not a concentric castle, again constrained partly by the site. You'll also notice that it was never actually finished. You'll see stonework built into the tower to key in a wall which was never built. It was after this rebellion that we get the building of Beaumaris, which is considered perhaps the masterpiece of Edward's castle building campaign in Wales. This is on Anglesey, which had been one of the centres of Llewellyn ap Griffith's authority, and was one of the areas in northern Wales which is actually most productive in terms of agriculture, on the grounds that it's much flatter than most of the mountainous areas around here. So it was an important strategic spot. It's possible that the building of the castle at Beaumaris was initially planned at the same time as Harlech, Carnarvon and Conwy, as Edward is known to have visited Anglesey in 1282 or 1283. So it may have been planned or envisaged from the off, but it became much more pressing from the rebellion of 1294-5, when the English sheriff of Anglesey was actually hanged by Welsh rebels. And Beaumaris is built partly, at least, to reassert English authority. And you'll notice now that Gwynedd has been extinguished as a political polity, these castles are built now to control Gwynedd rather than to constrain it. You'll notice again Conwy, Beaumaris, Carnarvon, Harlech, all on the coast, all designed to be resupplied by sea. It's also worth incidentally, if anyone's wondering about the name Beaumaris, it's actually from the French for fair marsh. That's a picture of the outer wall of Beaumaris. Plan, again built in at least 2 stages, with a recorded cost of £11,386. With again a classic. This is it's initially built without with the whole or part of the wall missing, which was subsequently added. And in this plan, what's considered the sort of the classic concentric castle with double gatehouses and a very symmetrical design. Of course, it's worth bearing in mind that these gatehouses, they provided a lot of the accommodation within the castle. We've just been hearing about the uses of accommodation in castles. Gatehouses, the gatehouses in these castles were an important aspect of the accommodation and use. They were part of the general accommodation of the castle. The total recorded expenditure on Beaumaris is £14,444, 8 shillings and 10 pence, because it was never finished. You'll notice the towers go up to the level of the wall walk, and similarly the gatehouses are at the level of the wall walk. That's as far as they ever got. So even £14,444 didn't get you an entire castle. It's also worth bearing in mind that Edward's castles weren't built in isolation from other English castles in Wales. At the same time as Edward was building his castles, he was very deliberately encouraging English lords to build castles in Wales as well. Once Edward had conquered Gwynedd in 1283, he made grants of land in the area to English magnates as a reward for their service, and to give them a direct vested interest in maintaining English authority in Wales, to which end he encouraged them to build or rebuild castles in the area. These are some of the castles rebuilt in North Wales at this time, built or rebuilt: Harden, Hope, Holt, Chirk, Ruthin and Denbigh. As you'll notice, unlike Edward's castles, most of these are inland, so not designed to be resupplied by sea. I won't go through all of them again due to the constraints of time, but to take a couple of examples, this is Denbigh, which was in a lordship granted to Henry de Lacy, Earl of Lincoln, in October 1282, while the war was still being fought, partly by, in fact, Henry de Lacy himself, and building commenced there very soon after. Again, the castle was briefly taken by the Welsh in Madoc ap Llywelyn's rebellion in 1294 and damaged therein. And again, you get, it was built integrated with the walls of a borough. Essentially, you get the castle filling in a corner of the town wall. It's also interesting that in this case, you have a very innovative gatehouse, again, whose idea was we don't know, but very probably one of the masons employed by the king was also employed at Denbigh. And you have a gatehouse with 3 towers, passage into a central chamber and then out into the castle. You'll also notice that in this case, Denbigh came with polygonal towers rather than more usual round towers. Whether that had a particular significance, it's not clear. We'll see that in Carnarvon, the use of polygonal towers was very deliberately symbolic. This is Harden Castle, which was rebuilt at this time, and you'll notice one of the features of it is a round great tower with a central chamber, which may have been influenced by Edward I's tower at Flint. So you can see with these castles, there are various ideas being tried out, copied, and passed on to other castle builders. This is very much a era of architectural experimentation and development. Now, I've already talked about money quite a lot. Obviously, there are the expenses of the building material, but a lot of the expenses went on labourers. This is a report of James of St George and Walter of Winchester, 2 of Edward's major masons. Writing to the Treasurer and Barons of the Exchequer, those were the guys who kept track of the money and who insisted on all the accounts which provide us with so much useful information. 27th of February 1296, they write, "When this letter was written, we were short of £500 for both workmen and garrison. The men's pay has been and still is very much in arrear, and we are having the greatest difficulty in keeping them, because they simply have nothing to live on. If our Lord the King wants the work to be finished as quickly as it should be, and on the scale on which this has been commenced, we could not make do with less than £250 a week throughout the season. With it, this season could see the work well advanced. And sirs, for God's sake, be quick with the money for the works, as much as ever our Lord the King wills. Otherwise, everything done up to now will have been of no avail. And you can get a real sense of just how hand-to-mouth the building of these castles were. I mean, we've already seen it's Aberystwyth with it. They never even managed to get gates, basic stuff like gates and locks equipped. This was a major undertaking which was possibly slightly beyond the capability of the English medieval state, certainly stretching it to the maximum of its capacity. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is castles need garrisons. We've been hearing about households. If you want to defend a castle, you need to pay somebody to do that. And the costs of garrisons were enormous, which is partly why they weren't maintained unless absolutely necessary, and it partly explains why so many castles were captured so easily, because unless you're actually expecting to be attacked, it's too expensive to maintain a garrison. So if somebody comes and attacks you by surprise, this is a garrison at Beaumont. The cost of it: 10 men-at-arms, 70 shillings a week; 20 crossbowmen, 47 shillings and 10 pence a week; 100 footmen, £6 and 2 shillings, 6 pence a week, for a total of £9 and £12 a week. So if you were going to maintain that garrison for a year, that would be £629, which in terms of the income of the state is a lot of money. Similarly, we have huge numbers of masons and workmen, labourers employed in these works. At the time when St George and James of St George and Walter of Winchester were sending their piteous letter to the Exchequer, they were actually employing 400 masons, cutters and people who laid stones, 2,000 minor workmen, general labourers, 200 quarrymen, 30 smiths, and an unspecified number of carpenters. So that's at least, well, more than 2,630 men. As you've seen, all of them needed to be paid and fed and accommodated. And if you think of Beaumont at this time, with that number of people, it would have been the size of quite a major town, even by English standards. So this is a lot of provision. They also used 100 carts, 60 wagons, and 30 boats bringing stone and sea coal. So a major undertaking. The total recorded expenditure on Edward I on castles in Wales at in this period was £78,267, 11 shillings and sixpence. Now, to put that into some sort of perspective, this is a time when the ordinary annual revenue of the English crown, without additional taxation, was just £27,000. So that's 4 years of ordinary revenue. And at the same time, an earl could expect an income of £1,000 a year. So when we talk about the garrison costing £629, 4 shillings for a year, that's almost half the revenue an earl would have expected. So these are huge sums in terms of governmental spending. I'll talk a little bit about symbolism. Briefly, I realise I'm running quite short. Walls of Carnarvon I've already mentioned about, with the bands of colour and the polygonal towers. It's been suggested that this was meant to refer to the walls of Constantinople, but that's perhaps unlikely, as nobody in Wales would have known what the walls of Constantinople actually looked like, so it would have been a bit of a waste of the illusion. What's more likely is that it was a very deliberate evocation of Roman styles of building. This is a Roman tower which still survives at York. You'll see the polygonal design and the bands of colour. If we go back to Carnarvon, you can see the similarities. Also, very conveniently, Edward, when he was building Carnarvon, discovered a body. At Carnarvon, the body of a great prince, the father of the noble emperor Constantine, was found, the king ordering it to be placed honourably in the church. And this may or may not have been a deliberate reference to the legends of the Emperor Maximus, who was known in Welsh legend as Maxen Llegw. I mean, this is slightly conjectural whether the legends of this figure of Welsh legend were being deliberately evoked, or whether it was more the evocation of Roman authority generally. But this is very definite Edward referring to the Roman architecture as a symbol of his almost imperial authority. It's also worth noting, incidentally, that his queen was brought to Carnarvon very deliberately so that she could give birth to the future Edward, Prince of Wales, at Carnarvon, which would have been meant giving birth as a building site. There's a very nice tale from a 16th century Welsh antiquarian that Edward had promised the Welsh a prince who was born in Wales and couldn't speak English, and presented them with his baby son who was born in Wales and at that time couldn't speak at all. Again, whether that improved with the telling, this is a nice story. It's also worth noting that as with so many of the aspects of these castles, Edward wasn't being entirely innovative. This is Dover, the Great Tower of Dover. We've already seen mention of Dover Castle. Again, with the bands, coloured bands, there's a Roman lighthouse in Dover, which this was probably meant to refer to, and again, it's a similar idea of referring to Roman authority. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is just the sheer scale of these castles. They're still awesomely impressive even today, and at the time there would have been nothing in Wales of similar scale except possibly cathedrals such as St David's. So it was they were meant to very much overawe by sheer scale. I'll briefly finish with some consideration of the design of these castles. I've already mentioned Master James of St George, who was from Savoy, who has been held up as probably the mastermind behind these castles. There's been an awful lot of debate about this, which I haven't really got time to go into. But again, it's worth emphasising the sheer variety of these castles. Even when looking at the concentric castles, there's great variety in the design of their castles. There wasn't a standard plan. Each one was innovative in its own way. It's also bear in mind, of course, that there were lots of other masons involved in the building and design of these castles, including Bertram of Gascony, Walter of Hereford, Richard of Abingdon, and several other people we could name. And again, they were working very much in a tradition of castle building, particularly concentric castles, for instance. One design which would have been very influential was Kenilworth, which by 1266 had been built as a concentric castle with outer walls and an inner bailey. And Kenilworth was influential partly because it had withstood a siege of 8 months by royal armies in 1266. So the idea of a concentric castle as very powerful would have stuck in Edward's mind, as Edward was actually personally at that siege. You can see the influence in the development of Caerphilly, built by Gilbert de Clare, starting in 1268. And again, you have the concentric castle there. And it's worth bearing in mind, Caerphilly is an enormously impressive castle as well. And Edward may not just have had his mind on overawing Welsh princes, but also English martial lords. And Carnarvon, Conwy, may have been as much a symbol of Edward's authority over his English lords as over his Welsh lords. Now, I've talked a bit about the process of design, architects. Part of the problem is that there wasn't an idea of an architect as a separate profession in this period. An architect castles were designed by masons who also helped build them. So there wasn't a distinction between the person who designed the castle and the person who built it. And by the nature of the records, it's very difficult to tell who exactly was responsible for designing what and overseeing what, because that's not the sort of information which the records were designed to reveal. It's or record. It's worth noting that you can see the influence of James of St George from Savoy in certain architectural details, such as windows, which are common in the buildings he had already is known to have built in Savoy. But none of the castles he built in Savoy was remotely as impressive as the ones he was involved in building for Edward I. And I suppose you could say that these castles were a rare example of something designed by a committee which actually worked. Possibly with James of St George as a leading advisor, but very much in overall control was Edward I. So, just a couple of thoughts to end on. Edward I is the king of one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in Western Christendom, and the expense of these castles was enormous, almost beyond the capability of the state to maintain them. We'll see how badly maintained, we've already seen how badly maintained they were. Some of them were never even finished. So this is castle building on a scale at the very edge of the ability of the state to maintain it. The other thing to bear in mind is these have been considered to be the apogee of castle architecture. So it's worth considering how actually effectively they were, and considering the many times in which they were actually captured, which does raise the question of how effective they actually were. But on that note, I'll come to an end.